Long gloves hid the burns on her wrists until the laundress saw them and gasped. The first thing I noticed was how she carried the basket. Most women set a thing like that on their hip, brace it against the bone. She held it out in front of her with both arms straight, elbows locked, like she was making an offering of somebody's dirty shirts. I was sitting on the step outside the marshal's office eating a biscuit I didn't particularly want, and I watched her cross the yard behind the laundry, and I thought, that's a woman who doesn't want anyone behind her. I didn't think much more about it than that. I'd been in Garvey Creek 6 weeks by then. Came through following a horse thief named Dobbins who turned out to be somebody else's brother-in-law, which made the whole thing complicated in a legal sense. And while that got sorted, I'd taken up the deputy's badge on account of Marshal Hatch having gout so bad he couldn't get his boot on. It wasn't much of a town. 3 saloons, a feed store, a hotel that smelled of mildew, a church with a bell that hadn't worked in 2 years, and a Chinese laundry at the edge of the main street run by a man named Tao and his wife and their niece, who was the one with the basket. Her name, I found out later, was Mei Zing. She'd been in Garvey Creek about 4 months. Before that, Dobbins, not the horse thief, had brought her over on a contract from San Francisco. That's all I knew for a while, that and the gloves. She wore them every day. Light cotton, pale gray, went up past the wrist. In April, that's not so strange. In June, it's something else. The laundry was a 2-room building, a washroom and a drying room, with a narrow sleeping loft above. Tao ran the books and managed the accounts with the hotel and the railroad camp. His wife did most of the ironing. Mei Zing did the wash, the hauling, the boiling, the wringing, the heavy work from before first light until the afternoon, and then she'd carry deliveries while the light held. That's what she was doing with the basket. She didn't smile at anybody. I don't mean she was unfriendly. She just moved through this town like she was trying not to take up space in it, eyes down, hat low, and those gray gloves always on. People mostly didn't notice her, which I think was exactly what she intended. What I noticed, and what I should have moved on sooner about, was a man named Crail. Crail worked for a labor broker named Shepard who had a contract to supply Chinese workers to the new rail spur going in south of town. Shepard was legitimate, more or less, or at least he had the paperwork to say so. Crail was his enforcer, for lack of a better word. Big man, red-faced, wore a brown coat that was too small across the shoulders so the seams looked like they might let go if he took a breath wrong. He had authority over the rail workers and he used it freely, and somewhere in his understanding of things, Mei Zing fell under that same authority. I saw him grab her arm once outside the feed store, just grabbed it, stopped her mid-step and said something low I couldn't hear from where I was standing. She didn't pull away, didn't say anything. Stood very still until he was done talking, and then he let go and walked on, and she continued with her basket like nothing had happened. That same stillness I mentioned. That same way of not taking up space. I crossed the street and asked her if she was all right. She looked at me the way a person looks at a wall that suddenly started speaking. Not afraid exactly, more like she was recalculating something. Yes, she said, plain and flat. Not rude. I said if she had trouble with anybody in this town, she could come to the marshal's office. She looked at me a moment longer, then she nodded once and went on her way. That was the first real exchange we had. The second happened 3 weeks later, and it started with Dottie Parch. Dottie ran the hotel laundry, which is to say she was Tao's biggest account, and she treated that as leverage. She was a big woman with iron gray hair and an opinion on everything from rail policy to the proper way to boil a shirt, and she had a mouth on her that you could hear from 2 buildings away. She was not a cruel woman. She was just a woman who saw things that other people arranged not to see, and she could not keep quiet about what she saw. What she saw was the gloves. I was walking past the alley between the hotel and the hardware when I heard Dottie's voice go up a full octave, not angry, something more than that, and I stopped. I came around the corner and Dottie was standing there with both hands pressed to her cheeks, and Mei Zing was standing against the alley wall with her arms at her sides and the gloves were off. One was on the ground. The other was in Dottie's hand, and Dottie was making a sound I hadn't heard out of a grown woman in a long while, low and continuous, like a kettle just starting. The burns went from the base of her palms to above the wrist, old burns healed over, shiny and tight, but there were newer marks inside those thin lines, some of them still scabbed from something narrow. A strap maybe a rod. I didn't say anything. I stepped into the alley entrance and I stood there so nobody walking past could see in, and I let Dottie recover herself. She held Mei Zing's hands in hers for a while. Mei Zing let her. Mei Zing's face was, I couldn't read it. She wasn't frightened of Dottie. She looked more like someone waiting to see what a new thing would do. Dottie looked up at me. She didn't ask a question. She had the same face my mother got when she wanted a thing done and wasn't going to dignify the situation by requesting it like it wasn't obvious. I picked up the glove off the ground and I gave it back to Mei Zing. She took it and pulled it on. Then she looked at me again, that same recalculating look. "Krail," she said, just the one word. I said, "Tell me." She told me. Not all of it, not that day. She told me enough. That Krail had decided on no authority anybody wrote down that Mei Zing owed Shepard's company for her passage over, on top of the original contract, and that the interest on that debt was her hours at the laundry on top of what she already owed Tao. She worked 6 days for Tao and Krail collected 1. It had been like that for 4 months. When she'd complained to Shepard, Krail had made his feelings known in the way the marks on her wrists described. I asked her why she hadn't come to the marshal. She looked at me like that might be the first genuinely funny thing she'd heard all year. "Man like Krail," she said, "has papers, has friends, has been here 10 years. I have been here 4 months. I said, "I understand that. Tell me anyway." She looked at the ground for a moment. Then she said, quiet, "Tao says stay out of trouble. If there is trouble, we lose the laundry contract. If we lose the contract, we go, all of us." That was the shape of it. She was protecting her uncle and his wife. Every week she went along with it to keep the roof over their heads, and she wore the gloves so Tao's wife wouldn't see and make a scene that would get them all thrown out of town. I thanked her. I told her not to say anything to Tao yet. She said, "What will you do?" I said I didn't know exactly. That was the truth. I said, "Whatever it is, it won't land on you." She studied me for 3 long seconds. Then she gave one of those single nods and she picked up her basket and she left the alley. Dottie watched her go. Then she turned to me and said, in a perfectly level voice, "You fix this." I said I intended to. I want to be honest about something. I had been a lawman in various jurisdictions for going on 22 years by the time I arrived in Garvey Creek. I'd been shot twice, had one finger that didn't straighten all the way anymore, and I'd watched enough men talk their way out of consequence to know what it looked like when the game was rigged from the start. I was 51 years old, and I had no illusions about the machinery of a place like this. A labor broker with a county contract had pull. Krail was a tool of that pull. The kind of situation where a deputy marshal with temporary jurisdiction walks in waving the law around tends to end, with the deputy marshal being reminded that his jurisdiction is temporary. I understood all of that. But I had seen her arms. There is a thing I have noticed over 2 decades of this work, and it is this. You can know a situation is complicated, and you can know it will cost you, and you can know there's a fair chance it won't go clean. And still, in your chest, there is a thing that has already made up its mind, and all the rest is just you catching up to it. I went and found Hatch. He was sitting with his foot up on a crate, his boot cut open to accommodate the swelling, reading a month-old newspaper. I told him what I'd seen and what Mei Zing had told me. He listened with his eyes on the newspaper for a while. Then he set it down and rubbed his face. Shepard'll say it's a contractual dispute, he said. I said I know. Crale'll say she came to him with some story, some misunderstanding. I said I know. You got her testimony, you got the marks, but he's got 10 years here and she's got 4 months. I said, I know all of that, Dick. I'm telling you what I saw. He looked at his foot. He was quiet a while. What do you want from me? He said. I said I wanted him to sit in the office while I talked to Shepard. I wanted a witness to the conversation. I wanted it documented that I'd reported this to the acting marshal and that he'd received the report. He looked at me a while. That's all, he said. I said that was all, right now. He said, all right. I went to Shepard's office, which was above the feed store, and I told him what I knew and what I intended to do about it, which was write up a formal complaint and send it to the county seat. Shepard was a thin man who looked like he'd been dried out by some industrial process. He sat behind his desk, and he was very polite and very careful, and he said that was certainly my prerogative, and that there were some things I might not fully understand about labor contracts in this county, and that Crale was a valuable and trusted employee, and that he was sorry if there had been some misunderstanding with one of the workers. He said he'd look into it personally. He did not say he'd speak to Crale. I noticed that. I went back to the office and wrote the report. 4 pages. I sent a copy to the county seat and I kept a copy. That night Crale came to see me. I was expecting that. He came in without knocking, which told me something, and he stood in the doorway, and he was wearing the brown coat, and he was not pleased. He told me I didn't understand the situation. I said probably not, tell me. He told me the Chinese workers had obligations, and that somebody had to manage those obligations, and that I, coming in from outside, didn't appreciate the particular difficulties of that work. He was careful too, like Shepard. Everybody was being careful. He was explaining things to me in the patient tone of a man explaining rain to someone he thinks is simple. I let him finish. Then I said, I've sent the report. It's at the county seat. Copies in 3 places. There's nothing to undo. He looked at me for a while. He said, you want to be careful, coming in here and stirring up things you don't understand. I said I'm usually careful. Mostly it works out. He left. I sat in the chair and I listened to him go down the stairs, and I was not particularly afraid, but I was not afraid either. Crale was a man who was used to things going his way, and men like that tend to make the situation more complicated before it resolves. I slept with the door locked and the rifle on the table. Nothing happened for 9 days. That's the thing they don't tell you about this work. Most of the time it's waiting. Most of the time it's the long silence after you've done the thing and you're sitting in it, wondering if it took. I went about the days. I had a horse thief to deal with, a real one this time, and a property dispute over water rights, and I ate my dinners at the hotel and nodded to people I was starting to know, and I watched the laundry at the edge of Main Street out of the corner of my eye. I saw Mazing every 2 or 3 days. She always had the basket. The gloves were always on. We didn't speak much. Once she was coming out of the laundry as I was walking past, and she stopped and looked at me and said, very straight, nothing has happened to us, meaning to Tao and his wife and to the arrangement they had. I said, good. She said, Crale has not come for his money. I said, I know. She said, what does that mean? I said I thought it meant he was waiting to see what happened with the county seat. It meant he wasn't sure how exposed he was. Men like that, the ones with the patience to wait, those were the ones you watched. She was quiet a moment, then she said, you are being careful. I said I try. She said, are you always like this, careful and quiet? I thought about that. I said, mostly. Sometimes it's not enough, but it's mostly the right way to be. She looked at me for a bit, then she said, my uncle says you are the kind of man who doesn't make a sound until he does. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She nodded that single nod again, and she went on with her basket. The county seat wrote back on a Thursday. The letter was from a man named Aldrich, who was the assistant to the county administrator, and it was politely and thoroughly useless. It acknowledged receipt of my report. It noted that labor contract disputes were a complex area of territorial law. It suggested that the parties involved might benefit from a formal mediation process, which could be arranged at a cost of $14, split between complainant and respondent. It said that pending such mediation, the county would note the complaint in the official record. I read that letter twice. Then I wrote another one longer, harder, with the exact statutory language from the Territorial Code on labor coercion, which I happened to know because I'd spent an evening with Hatch's law books. And I sent it back to Aldrich and copied it to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, and to a judge named Carver who I'd testified before 3 years prior, and who I knew to be a man who read his mail. Then I went to find Dottie Parch. I told her what the county had said. She received this with the expression of a woman who had been expecting exactly that and was only irritated, not surprised. I told her what I planned to do. I told her there was something else I needed. I needed Mei Xing's testimony written down, witnessed by someone the court would take seriously. Dottie said, "I can witness it." I said, "That's what I was hoping." She said, "Will it help?" I said it might, it won't hurt, and it means she's on the record, means she said so clearly and someone heard her. Dottie was quiet a moment, then she said, "She doesn't trust easily." I said I knew. Dottie looked at me in that way she had, that weighing look, and she said, "She talks about you." I didn't say anything. Dottie said, "She says you're the first person here who asked her to explain instead of deciding she didn't matter." I said I was just doing my job. Dottie gave me a look that suggested she found that answer somewhat inadequate, but she let it go. Mei Xing came to the marshal's office on a Friday evening after the laundry closed. She sat in the chair across from my desk and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and I wrote down what she told me. All of it this time. Not just Crail, the whole of it, the contract, the debt Shepard claimed she owed, the way Crail had collected on it, every instance she could recall with a date and a description. It took 2 hours. Dottie sat in the corner with her arms folded and didn't say a word the whole time. Halfway through, Mei Xing paused. She looked at her gloved hands. She said, "My father was a school teacher in Fujian province. He taught me to write. He thought it was important." She said it like she was telling me something small. He said, "A person who can write down what happened cannot be erased, because the paper remembers even when the people forget." I didn't know what to say to that either. I wrote it in the margin of the testimony page, those words, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be somewhere. We finished around 8 o'clock. Dottie signed as witness. I signed as the recording officer. Mei Xing looked at the pages for a moment. Then she put her hand flat on them, just rested it there, the gray glove on the white paper. She said, "My father would have liked this." I said I thought her father sounded like a good man. She said he was. She picked up her hat. Then she said, without looking at me, "You are also a good man. I think you have been one for a long time, and perhaps nobody has said so." I didn't say anything. I'm not sure what a person says to that. She said, "I am saying so, because it is true, and because my father taught me it is important to say what is true." She put her hat on and she left. Dottie looked at me from her corner. She said nothing, but she looked at me the way women sometimes look at men who are slow to understand things. The response from Cheyenne came 11 days later. Judge Carver, it turned out, had known Aldrich from some prior business and apparently had opinions about him. The Territorial Marshal's office sent a man, a young fellow named Briggs, well-pressed, competent, and he came in with papers that made the county mediation process irrelevant. Briggs interviewed me. Briggs read the testimony. Briggs went and talked to Crail. I don't know exactly what happened in that conversation because I wasn't present. What I do know is that Crail left Garvey Creek on the Saturday of that week with his bedroll and his brown coat and his things in a rucksack, and Shepard's labor contract for the rail spur was suspended pending review, and Shepard himself spent a great deal of money on a lawyer from Denver who came highly recommended. Tao's laundry contract stayed. I made sure Briggs understood that the laundry was uninvolved and that the family's standing in town should not be affected. Briggs was a careful man. He understood. The formal complaint went into the territorial record. Mei Xing's name was in it. Her words were in it. What had happened to her wrists was in it. She could not be erased. On the Monday after Crail left, I came out of the marshal's office in the morning, and there was a bundle on the step. A shirt, laundered and pressed so clean it looked new, though I knew it was one of mine. The collar had a wear mark I recognized, folded in a particular way, tight and precise. On top of it was a note, 4 words in a careful hand. He taught me right. I stood on the step holding that shirt for a while. Marshal Hatch came out behind me with his boot cut open and his coffee, and he looked at the shirt, and he looked at me and he said, "You going to stand there all morning?" I said, "Probably not." He said, "That Chinese girl leave you that?" I said, "It appeared so." He said, "She does good work." I said, "She does. Her father was a school teacher." He thought it was important. Hatch looked at me with the expression of a man who is too old to pretend he doesn't know what he's seeing. He went back inside. I stayed in Garvey Creek another 2 months. The Dobbins business got sorted eventually, and in the meantime there was enough actual work to justify the badge. I told myself that's why I stayed. Mei Xing and I started talking in the evenings sometimes, when the laundry was closed, and she'd come out and sit on the back step with a tin cup of tea. I'd come around the side of the building and lean against the fence post and we'd talk. She had a dry humor that came out in small, unexpected places, and she asked questions about things, about how territorial law worked, about what I'd seen in different parts of the country, about horses, which she was interested in, and she listened the way very few people listen, like she was keeping every word somewhere safe. She told me more about Fujian, about her father's schoolroom, which apparently was just a room above a market with 6 students and 1 chalkboard, about the crossing over, which she described in 3 flat sentences and then moved on from, because there were some things she said it was not useful to talk about at length, about what she wanted, and this was the most careful she ever was, the most I ever saw her weigh her words. What she wanted was to stay, to have work that was hers, and a place that was hers, and to be a person who could not be moved around by someone else's decision. I said, "That's a fair thing to want." She looked at me, she said, "Do you think it is possible here?" I said I thought Garvey Creek was probably not the final destination, but I thought the territory was large. I thought there were places where a person with her abilities and her father's education could build something that held. She said, "And you, what do you want?" I'd been asked that question before. I'd given the standard answers: enough work, a decent horse, no trouble I couldn't manage. I thought about saying those. Instead, I said, "I'd like to be somewhere long enough that people knew my name." I said I'd spent 22 years passing through things, and I was tired of it. She said, "You have been here almost 4 months." I said, "I know." She said, "Hatch's foot is not going to be bad forever." I said, "No, probably not." She looked at her tea. She said, very quiet, "You do not have to go when his foot heals." I stayed very still with that. She said, "The town does not have a permanent deputy. I think Hatch would ask you. I think he has been waiting to see if you wanted to be asked." I said, "I didn't know that." She said, "I know, then. I am telling you because I think you would like to know, and because—" She stopped. She looked at the fence post I was leaning on. She said, "Because I think Garvey Creek would be better for having you in it." "And I would be better for—" She stopped again. I didn't fill the silence. She said, "For having someone here who asked me to explain instead of deciding I didn't matter." The sun was low and the light came through the gap between the laundry and the hardware, and it was on her face, and she was looking at her tea, and she had both hands around the cup, gloves off. She'd taken to going without them in the evenings, just here, just on this step. The marks on her wrists were there. She didn't cover them. She knew I'd seen them, and she'd decided I was someone who could see them. I said, "I'll talk to Hatch tomorrow." She looked up. I said, "About the position." She looked at me for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. Not a smile exactly, more like the easing of something that had been held tight for a long time. Her shoulders dropped a quarter-inch, and the set of her jaw softened, and she looked, for just that moment, like someone who had put down a basket she'd been carrying a very long way. She said, "Good. Just that good. I talked to Hatch. He said, and I am giving you his exact words, 'Took you long enough. I've had a coffee pot that made decisions faster than you.' I took the position. The first week of October that year I was still in Garvey Creek. The following spring I was still there. That summer, Mei Zing's Uncle Tao sat with me for an afternoon and we talked, through some difficulty of language and some work on both our parts, about certain things. He was a formal man. He took the conversation seriously. At the end of it he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in his careful English, "She has waited a long time to trust." I said I understood. He said, "You are certain?" I said I was. He looked at me with the particular look of a man who has seen a great deal of the world's capacity for cruelty, and is deciding whether to believe in something different. Then he said, "All right." We were married in the spring of the following year in the church with the bell that still didn't work. Dottie Parch cried, which nobody was particularly surprised by. Hatch stood up for me. He had both boots on by then. After, we walked back along the main street in the late afternoon light, just the two of us. She had her hand in my arm. The gloves she wore that day were white, for the occasion, and they went above the wrist, and I knew what was beneath them, and she knew I knew, and neither of us said anything about it. We got to the laundry and she stopped. She looked at the building for a moment, the faded paint, the steam that came out under the door even now, the smell of soap and hot water that was just part of the air here. She'd spent 5 years of her life in that building, not all of it what she'd have chosen, some of it what she'd made for herself. She reached down and pulled off one glove, then the other, folded them together in her hands. She said, "My father said a person who writes down what happened cannot be erased." I said, "I remember, you told me." She said, "I want you to know you are written down, in me, what you did." She looked at the gloves in her hands. "It does not go away." I didn't say anything. I took her hand, the bare one, the scarred one, and I held it, and we stood there in the street in the late afternoon in Garvey Creek until the light changed. That's the whole of it. That's what I carry.